Since Mike Norton's last interview, a lot more information has come to light about some of the things he talked about, such as the Arcturus murders. And so we've decided to have another interview with Mike to share this information with you. Welcome, Mike. Nice to see you again.
Hi, John. You too. Likewise. Yeah, quite a lot has come out of interest from people involved in the whole thing after the sort of police investigation. So, it's something I'd like to sort of just, put out there, because it's actually fascinating to me. Things we didn't work in that world. We didn't know they happened. But what happened after that whole talk on the Arcturus murder? Several people got hold of me, both either by comment or by email or by other means. The first of one was John Sneyman. John and his brother-in-law. I had him incorrectly as his cousins, not his brother-in-law. The two guys who acquired the weapon that was supplied to Berwick James. Initially, I thought that weapon had come from Mozambique. Well, I was nearly right. It had come from a contact in Motoko when the RLI had hit a group of goods coming in and had killed 10, but recovered 12 weapons. So in good RLI tradition, as you well know, the other 2 weapons were not handed in. Well, the alert SB guy in Motoko let word get out that we know they're 12. You Skabangas, can we have the other 2 back, please? And there'll be a crate of beer for each one that's given back. Well, one was returned, so that left the one, and that was the one that through one of the guys in the command, one of the commandos, ended up being sold to Brian Harding, and his last comments to me was, he said he only sold it to Berwick James the day before the murders. Brian, I've got to argue with you a little bit on that one. I think it was a little bit earlier, because he had time to then do the doctoring of the weapon.
Yeah.
But anyway, no matter. That's the weapon, and it was subsequently traced and numbered and all the rest of it, as we do know. So if I got that slightly wrong, guys, I apologize. One of the very, very interesting emails I got was what actually happened to Berwick James in the days before he actually killed himself. Apparently the routine was, if you're a condemned prisoner, you're watched continually. And you're allowed to visit, I think, every week. You've got to talk through a thick glass through telephone. No contact is allowed. Any gifts are searched by the guards. And that's the process James was going through until he was actually, a date was set for him to hang. 3 days before a condemned prisoner actually is hung, he's allowed a family visit where they're actually allowed to go into the visiting room physically and able to touch each other and obviously say the last farewells. And gifts are brought. Any gift goes through the guard without question. But what had happened is Berwick James had a girlfriend which was unknown to us at that time, not the one that he was arrested with, but another pregnant girl of 18 years old. He had somehow convinced her to hide a broken razor blade into a tube of close-up toothpaste, and somehow the guards had missed it. So he had this. Obviously, this was smuggled into him. I think it was on the day 3 before the sentence was to be carried out. And there was an interesting story. But one of the defence team also got hold of me, and he said he'd been obviously talking to James with this whole thing, and he had given him a razor blade, not a razor blade, a sharpener and some pencils. So I'll come back to that in a minute. Anyway, 2 days before he was due to hang, Berwick James obviously got himself under his blankets, but he's under constant surveillance, and managed to slice his wrist to right through to the bone, slice his carotid arteries here, deep down, and his temples. And he bled out so quickly that the guard didn't notice anything until such time as there was a pool of about 5 liters of blood under the mattress on the bed. They obviously opened the cell very quickly, but he was certified dead. He was dead in the cell, but by the time he got to the prison hospital, he was certified as completely dead. Well, the guy on the defense team was a bit, when he heard about this, was a bit worried, because he knew he delivered this pencil sharpener and whatever a couple of days before. So he hot-footed it to the prison to find, thank goodness, as far as he was concerned, his sharpener had not been used, and it had been a smuggled razor blade. So, it was a fascinating process in terms of James's thinking. And one of the guys, again on the defense team, said, look, let me use a bit of modern, what are they called, profiling on this. And he said, if you had a guy like Beric James today, he would be certainly narcissistic. And the term he used, let me just look at my notes so I get it absolutely right. Narcissistic future faking, which means he was unable to feel any compassion, unable to feel sympathy for anybody, and was entirely on his own mission in life. And that was that. And he would do whatever he needed. And he says that committing suicide before the hanging was typical of a character like this, is that he would not be defeated to be hung. He would rather kill himself first.
Sure.
So it was an extraordinary whole lot of information that came to me. And then on the slightly more gory side, a guy who was involved in the prison said to me, do you know how these people are disposed of? I said, well, what sort of people? He said, well, condemned people. I said, no, never really thought about it. So he said, well, they're actually put in a coffin, face down, with their arms by their sides, and they are buried in an unmarked grave. This one would have been probably near Chikurubi, what became the support unit base at Chikurubi. Ignominy is the word they use. They want these people to be ignominious completely, and the only record left of them is on the prison records and on the death register, on the hanging register. So, despite the fact James had killed himself, he was disposed of in exactly the same way. Or just to add to a bit of gory to it, said when the cement factory big furnaces were working, they used to toss the condemned prisoners into there and have them therefore cremated. So I just thought I'd add that bit of light to the whole thing. Another very interesting thing that came out of the defense team, they could never truly track Beric James's history to where he was born and some of his early life history. They couldn't find it. And even up till 3 years before he got to Arcturus mine, they had a very hazy picture of his background. And they're surmising. I mean, we're obviously surmising on this whole thing now, but there were unsolved cases in the years before Beric James murders. Beric James did this particular murder, and it's not beyond the realm of the possibility that he was actually the perpetrator of some of these other crimes, because they bore a very similar hallmark. Sure, really. And yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, we'll never know now. And he's gone, and that's the story. But that was just very interesting to come out of that whole discussion, and interesting how much it brought extra information that I was and a lot of people were completely unaware of. So thank you, gentlemen, for all the input you gave. And I hope I've summarized it correctly on the whole thing. John, the second thing that's a lot of things have come back on is the dreaded old UFO. I got sent a clip from the Pentagon, from a very authoritative document which I can only mark with the Pentagon or the rest of it, saying that the Pentagon has now admitted that they're in possession of a craft not of this world. Apparently, it's the first time this has been admitted ever. So that I would love to look more into. I'm not a UFO buff or anything like that, but it's quite clear there is, in my mind, there's got to be something a little bit more into this whole thing. And then very kindly, and one of the ex-SAS guys had sent me something from the squadron diary from 8th Squadron in 1979. They were coming back from Operation Purple, flying from over the Mukumbura area, coming back to Darwin after doing a lot of mining. vehicle mining in Mozambique. And it was just getting to last light, and they were getting towards the Rhodesian mountains there. And these 3 lights kept following them in the distance and hovering around, and they apparently tried to do a bit of side slipping and moving, and these continued to follow them. Once they got over the mountains and sort of had Darwin's lights in the distance, these things streaked off, much as I told on my experience, streaked off into the distance. Obviously gone, and nothing picked up anywhere. And the pilot's name was Martin Boer, and he actually wrote it in the 8th Squadron diary on that particular date.
Sure.
So amazing stuff. And another very interesting thing is we were talking about, when I was talking about Enterprise and the farm attacks, and he said it wasn't the Enterprise area, it was another area where a capture was taken, and he was interrogated and whatever. And they asked him why he was attacking this farm, that farm, the next farm, and he said, yeah, whenever we wanted to go to farm Z as well, and they said, why didn't you go there? No, when we got there, there was a whole lot of soldiers outside the fence. They were all dressed in white uniforms, and they were carrying weapons. So we left it. Now, okay, what happens here now? So anyway, look, that one I do find that, it could be a bit of fantasy, but anyway, that's again, additional information that came out of that whole UFO setup. I don't know if you remember the Ariel School in 1994, just near Goromonzi, not far from Arcturus, in fact, very close to Arcturus, when I think it was 24 children of age between 6 and 9, I think, ran in at break time, outside at break time, ran in to get their teachers, who were obviously having tea, and they said, come outside, come, there's people here visiting us. And the teachers went outside, and one teacher does relate that she saw exactly what the children described, an orb-shaped vessel on the ground, and out of the vessel came 2 very short men in what appeared to be a sort of a uniform, with sort of a strange, almost a triangular face, and looked at them. The children got quite nervous, obviously, and backed off. And a short time later, they went back into the vessel, and it did the same thing. It shot off at a huge speed. Now, interesting enough, shortly after that, and years later, there was a very prominent lady here involved in the UFOs, whose name I'll think of. She got an American professor who's involved in the whole UFO worldwide to come out and speak to these children. They had drawn at the time, the teachers had said at the time, draw what you saw, or what you thought you saw. And the drawings were identical, absolutely identical. So they separated them and said, do the drawings again. Once again, they were identical. Some years later, this professor came out, got hold of them. They were now 4 or 5 years older, and said, please draw what you saw. And they drew exactly the same picture. So who knows? Let's not do UFO stories. John, the other thing I just thought of, there were quite a few things that happened in my, before the Enterprise time, in my sort of early Special Branch career, which started in '76. And my first posting was actually, we were all sent there as a rite of passage to the dreaded Mukumbura, Mukus by the sea. And time I was there, it was not very, obviously it was the sort of free Mozambique had obviously taken over Mozambique, but things were still relatively peaceful. Mukumbura was a transit area. We did our best to catch the groups of insurgents who were coming through, and they were basically transiting through that area as fast as they could, but did have contact with the people. And just at that time, the first keep had been constructed. A keep, was, for those who don't know, was they gathered all the local people, took them away from their traditional fields, and always put them into a large, very large barbed wire stockade for their own safety. In my own mind, I think that was probably not one of the cleverest moves in the world. But however, what it did help us a bit with that, is we could be sure that any insurgents who wanted food or whatever had to come to that particular area. We rapidly worked out that we were being fairly silly, because the food had been left for them in the fields, because the people went out during the day. and left food for them in the field. So we were not as clever as we thought we were. But it did occasionally give us the tabs on some of the groups passing through. And we did have the odd punch up. We used to sit out on the next to the keeps at night with night vision, very rudimentary night vision equipment. And we did pick up a couple of groups, but it was a very fleeting situation, because there's 4 of you trying to chase these guys, and they're hood-footing it away, and they don't really want to. They're not interested to fight. And we obviously got the odd kill, but it was nothing particularly substantial. But one of the interesting things that happened, I was there when the minefield had reached Mukumbura and had actually gone through. Now, the minefield was a copy of these. All ex-soldiers or policemen will know. Copy of the Israeli fence that goes between Jordan and Israel, and it's a complex. I discovered. I actually thought when I first looked at it, I thought it's a couple of barbed wire fences, but when you actually look into it, there was 3,000 AP anti-personnel mines per kilometer, 12 plowshares which were above ground exploding, basically huge claymores per kilometer. Never mind the fencing and everything else that went along. But on that particular patch, the Mukumbura, halfway from Kanyemba to about 25 k's beyond Mukumbura itself, the whole fence was alarmed with sensors. And in my salubrious accommodation, sleeping on the floor in Mukumbura in the control room, this huge sort of box of lights and each one gave you coordinates as to where the fence had been interfered with, so it happened frequently where you suddenly wake up or look at the thing and the right light B7 would go off, which meant that 8.4 kilometers south of west of Mukumbura, the fence had been breached. Well, to sort that out, what the behind us was 4 guns of the Rhodesian artillery, the 25-pounders. And the plan was they would be given the coordinates immediately, range onto that area, fire, trying not to land on the fence itself, but only fire onto the Rhodesian side. It was a bit of an unwritten truce in those days where we didn't fire across into Mozambican territory. In the time I was there, and I did 3 stints in Mukumbura. I recall a couple of Majibas, maybe. Some animals, because sadly a lot of the time they were triggered by animals. But in my mind, that was a massively expensive. It was abandoned after Mukumbura, because it proved to be of no effect whatsoever. We used to follow up in the morning after it at first light and find that a kudu or an elephant or something had gone through the fence or gone into the fence and been blown up, and quite often after the bigger animals we had to shoot them. Not a happy story at all. There were cases where didn't ever happen to me, but they were where the insurgents were found in the middle of the minefield, obviously badly injured. Now that created another huge problem, getting the guys out of there. You have to have the sappers come along, cut the fence, lift all the mines, and then in the meantime, this guy bleeding out in the middle of the minefield, and nobody really too interested in helping him. But that's the nature of the beast, I'm afraid. So it was a very interesting time to be there. And I suppose what also happened is, which gave me ideas for later on in Enterprise days, we got a section of the artillery and an infantry role on motorcycles. Well, they were promptly named the scooter scouts, as you will imagine. And they ranged up and down the fence line pretty effectively, because they obviously mobile, and but it became pretty soon known that they were doing this, and a couple of mines were actually lifted and planted in the road, AP mines. I don't recall them ever doing any damage, but there were a few explosions, a few frights were given to people. Going back to the scooter, that gave me the days of Enterprise, gave me the idea of the mobility of the motorbikes. The characters in the engineers were unbelievable. I mean, I mentioned a couple of people. Keith Bing, I believe Keith has now sadly died. One-legged Jim Datson, guess what? He'd lost his leg on a mine. And George Swan, another massive character. These guys were absolutely unbelievable and completely fearless. When you consider that over the time of the laying of the minefield, the 676 kilometers of minefield, through past Mutari all the way down there, 97 engineers were badly injured and 30 were killed. So it was not a very good pastime. Unfortunately, George Swan was killed in front of my eyes. Where he climbed on top of the storage bunker in the front of Mukumbura, just before the river. And we always had mortars ranged just in case. And he decided to move this mortar because he felt it wasn't quite in the right position. And he thought, no, what he'll do is he'll just drop a mortar into the river, and just to make sure he's roughly got it set based properly, and then range it up a bit so if he needed, he could fire onto the Portuguese Aldamento across the river where the Frelimo were. Unfortunately, he had it a little bit too steep an angle, and it hit a branch above his head and exploded and killed him. It should never have gone off at that range. As you well know, the arming range of a 60mm mortar is about 35 meters, I think. So that whole batch of ammunition of mortar bombs had to be recalled. And it was discovered that there was a fault on the fuse. So look, it's your day, I suppose. Very sad. So that was old George Swan. If I can describe, across the river from us was the Frelimo garrison, and they had weapons there. There was no question about that, and it was difficult to see because it was a good kilometre and a quarter across there. So even though using binoculars or whatever, it's difficult to see what's actually there. But we did see anti-aircraft guns every now and then. We'd see the Frelimo parading every now and then. Gone were the days of where the special branch guy could cross the river and go and get some beers across there. Even in the early Frelimo time, that used to happen. I remember Winston Hart was one of the famous guys for doing that. But things weren't as easy now. Although there was an almost unwritten law, we were not shoot at each other in this particular position. One particular day, 4 fellows from the artillery arrived, led by Sergeant Brian Wishart, and he's had a message from me from my OC then, Bob, in Mount Darwin, to say, look, these guys will tell you what the story is. Please accommodate them, give them whatever they need, and let them get on with what they're required to. Bob Skonker, my boss in Mount Darwin. And what they said to me is they've been told to climb up the radio mast, which stood in front of the pub, the Mukumbura Surf Club pub, a police radio mast, 35 meters high, I think. The standard ones at most police stations that you see. In fact, you still see them there now. And observe across the river to find out what actually is there. No reason was given, nothing, just follow orders, that's what we're going to do. So we had a good look, it was just late afternoon, so we had a good look at the mast. And with much trepidation, these fellows, one was Nigel Huff, who is not scared of much, nor was Brian, and two other guys. So they made a plan. They said, okay, what are we going to do tomorrow? Before first light, we're going to climb that pole, and we're going to put 2 sandbags up at the top there. There's not much room, but we just feel a little bit better. We've got a little bit of protection because we're certain that they're going to start shooting at us. So I said, well, guys, I'm not sure. I said, there's sort of an unwritten law, but you suddenly appear and up there now, obviously doing nefarious activities. They might well decide to start pot-shotting at you. So we reinforced our firepower facing the camp in the trenches we had. We had substantial trenches there, and said, "Fine, we'll obviously back you up if the whole thing turns nasty." Brian was the first one to go up the following morning in daylight. Took his radio up with him, and got to the top and sat there. And he wasn't noticed for a while. We sat there watching. He wasn't noticed for a while. Then all of a sudden, I heard a bit of shouting across the river and all the rest of it. Got 10 or 12 faces of people come running to their trench. They're looking up, pointing rifles. And I thought, here we go. The war's going to start. Not a shot fired. After about half an hour, the gesticulating and everything stopped and went quiet, and things went like things were absolutely normal. Each day you get the odd one who, when the guy climbed up there, they'd shout and scream and whatever, but eventually after a week or so that died down. And what Brian and the guys were doing was the best they could with a very substantial telescope, mapping what they could see across in the Aldamento. They slowly started to piece together the picture that there were about 8 14.5 multi-barrel anti-aircraft guns there. There certainly were a lot of 12.7s. There were some what appeared to be trucks covered with canvas, which looked like they could well have anti-aircraft or ground support weapons on them, and built quite a big picture. And I fed the picture back to Darwin once a week, and as built the picture, very interesting. Then I was asked to go up to Darwin one day, and I got briefed by the Air Force and said what they want to do is to find out what exactly is under those canvas on the trucks, particularly, because that's a particular interest to them. And I didn't ask any questions. I said, fine, well, how do you propose to do this? He said, what we'll do, we're going to send a Lynx down, fully armed, and he's going to do about 3 kilometers inside the Rhodesian border. He's going to do a mock strike on the basis, and he'll put a lot of smoke down, and behind that will come 2 hunters, which will then do a practice run onto that particular smoke strike as a practice for camp attacks and strafing and whatever. So I said, okay, fine. But what I didn't know, of course, is what emanated is the Lynx arrived, and the pilot hopped out, Carl Willems, his name was, 4 squadron pilot, and he came across to me and said, jump in. So I said, oh, why? He said, no, you know the ground around here, you get in. So I said, okay, I'm not aircraft, don't worry me. But so I jumped in behind him on the seat in the Lynx, and he showed me the various bits and pieces that were there, and so we took off we went. Got in radio contact with the hunters that were sort of about 10 or 12 minutes out, and they called in over there what they call their IP, their initial point, and said, when we call IP, put the strike in, because that'll take us 4 minutes to get to you. So we said, fine, and he picked a disused, the locals had all been moved, so there were quite a few disused huts. And he said, we're going to put the strike in on that hut there, and then the guys can come in with the hunters and have fun. So sure enough, on time, called IP, we went live in the dive and fired a pod of rockets and dropped a Fran onto this particular thing, a nice big plume of smoke and all sorts of things, and turned out port rapidly to get out of the way of the hunters. And they came screaming in and pounded the particular position. What I didn't know at the time, they had skirted just over the fence over Mokumbura.
Sure.
Barely on the Rhodesian side. So Carl said, right, we better get back to Mokumbura, but I've got some spare rockets I need to get rid of. And down here he spotted a jackal. So he said, I'm going to have a go at the jackal. So I said, okay, go for it. And he went into a very steep dive, chasing this particular jackal. It was jinking all over the place. Well, he missed the jackal. He missed the jackal completely. Got away, no, scot-free. So I had a good laugh at him on that one. Anyway, landing back at Mukas, all hubbub was on the go. There was tracer flying all over the place, not over us, straight up into the sky, almost observing the border. They'd followed we weren't going to shoot across you if you don't shoot at us. But what it had done, it wasn't Brian up the pole, I can't remember, one of the guys, he had a grandstand view of what actual armaments were there. Now, one of the most interesting I remember was a gas truck, which could carry either carry vehicles or people, and probably about, I would sense 60 people probably on that thing. And it was armed front and rear with two barrel 14.5 anti-aircraft weapons. So a formidable vehicle. And that's exactly what powers that be wanted. They wanted to know what was there. And anyway, everything calmed down. The hunters obviously disappeared. Carl flew back to Darwin, and we all settled down, shook our heads and said, okay, obviously we've done our task now. And the pole guys stayed there, I think, for another week. And then I think I was going back on time off as well. And we headed back to Darwin. It was on my next call up that one morning, about 4 in the morning, there was a thunder and banging and crashing in Mozambique, probably about 6 or 7 kilometers beyond Mukumbura. And having researched it back at now, it was the SAS that hit a Frelimo stroke Sandler convoy on that. And exactly one of those trucks was involved in the convoy. And the Lynx did a front end attack, knowing that the weapons could not depress over the cab far enough. So, for what I was told, that provided them with vital information. Otherwise, that Lynx would probably have been hammered quite badly. So it was interesting, a very interesting time on that whole sort of setup.
Sure.
And then I came across the fence guys again in Yamapanda, but this was before they were laying the mines. This was the Tetsi guys, Tetsi's department. The one guy I got to know very well, there was a guy called Jack Kerr, who was based actually at Kotwa with us when we were there in those days. And he was another ruffian, but great guy. Now, when the fence line was coming down, but the mines were following behind, and Jack was in charge of the clearing the fence area. I never forget one day when he had a huge baobab that he had to blow up. He didn't want to, but he had to. And it was an extraordinary way they'd done it. It almost lifted the baobab out the ground, like you were picking a mushroom, and threw it on the ground. It was extraordinary. He developed that over quite some period of time. But that was an interesting little period on the, just talking more about the minefield in general and all that sort of stuff. On the Motoko Kotwa side, I guess I cut my teeth at Motoko Kotwa in the early days of the. So in my previous talk, I said it was just after the first attacks at Daltina Farm in Centenary, when groups came into the Mudzi, Yamapanda, Motoko area, and Kotwa was a little Rhodes camp, about 17 k's from Yamapanda, where we were shunted off to and based there to do the intelligence work in those days as ground coverage in that vast area. And there were 4 of us, and we each had a vehicle, and our daily routine was to trot off into different areas and visit our sources and talk to people and find out try and find out what was going on. I mean, it was really a sort of leap in the deep end, because nobody ever trained us what to do. We just had to learn on our because all that hard work did pay off after the détente period, when we got extremely bored in the area, when there was nothing basically happening, except the one most unfortunate circumstance when the South African police were still around in those days, and they operated on the other side of the river, the Missouri River from us. And one particular day, they were down at the river. They had 4 men, and they had a BSAP constable attached to them. And they came down to the Missouri Bridge, probably get some water and stuff like that. And an unarmed insurgent walked across into the bridge and said, "Look, we need to know more about this ceasefire. Can somebody tell us what we need to do?" There was obviously a bit of bantering and shona between the insurgents in the background that they could see. And the constable said to the police, the South African policeman, "Don't do it, it's a trap." And they thought, "No, it can't be. We've got to talk to these guys about it." And they wandered onto the bridge. Well, the constable, the BSAP constable, just dived into the river with his rifle and everything else, and swam away. And the 4 South African policemen were massacred on the bridge in that incident.
Sure.
And it's very, very sad. The group leader of the massacre of the South African policemen was Herbert Shumbu, who became a very prominent leader later in the war. And as I'm reliably informed, after the ceasefire, or in Zimbabwe, under his real name, continued to, and may well still live in Zimbabwe today, although he will probably be a fairly old man by now. So that was an unfortunate, uncalled for incident, which where there was trust shown on one side and no trust shown on the other. Sadly for that. But I suppose one thing that détente period did get us to know the area incredibly well. And I sometimes think back now on those days and think, we must have been a little bit funny in the head, because there we were driving around, 2 of us, in a mine-proof Land Rover to some of the places were 2.5 hours from our base. We often stayed over at the internal affairs keeps and stuff like that, expecting not to be hammered. And then unfortunately one of us did get killed. It was Bruce Baker, as I mentioned before, when he was shot by his source, and a very good source, and led in the wrong direction. He and his constable were murdered, ambushed, and murdered.
Sure.
But that's it was not a particularly nice.
Yeah.
One of the other things just to mention about one of the things I came across in Matoka after the war got going again, we had done such good groundwork that we knew exactly when the big group of 108 were going to cross just south of Nyamapanda, and 10 RR had been moved up some week or so before, and they did very well against that group. And in fact, I can't remember the actual kill rate or whatever, but I know most of the group were actually chased back into Mozambique, which it was the Matoka. There were still farmers in Matoka, a huge reprieve on the whole thing. But one thing I did come across there was one of the bodies we got. One of them had the working parts of his AK firmly embedded in his forehead, and I thought, well, that's very odd. So I just took, take camera phones, and I was trying to get a photograph of just a box brownie or whatever it was. And I passed it around to a few people, and eventually the word came back. Okay, what you've come across is obviously one of the scouts or the SAS in their operations in Mozambique have found a cache with ammunition in, and they've removed the bullet and replaced the cordite with pentolite. And of course, that was what exactly happened. As he pulled the trigger, the rifle exploded, and it did obviously did him in. But I think that was stopped after a while when we started using a lot of the communist arms. It was just going to be just plain dangerous. So I think that actually went out of fashion.
Yeah.
One of the other things we used was radio tracking. There was a short-lived episode of trying to radio track, where you place in a store which is going to be broken into a prominent radio, and they would take it. And when it was on, the homing device was off. When it was off, the homing device was on. And the helicopter Becker homers could track that. But unfortunately, it never really got anywhere because they required to be too close a range to get a good signal onto it. So it was tried several times, I think with one success. But it was, all things, we're trying to do force multipliers here, trying to do tricks that might help, as you remember, John, the biggest problem with the war is it's not fighting, it's locating.
Yeah.
Locating the enemy, that was the biggest problem. And then we had one episode with listening devices where we knew there was an insurgent, because we're fairly close to the Mozambique border. He was definitely toing and froing from Mozambique to his home area, and it was the days before the keep, so the locals were all living all over the place. And we actually put a radio listening device into this house secretly. And we had a call sign about 2 kilometers away on a feature, and they could hear clearly what was going on. And it was obviously had a couple of Shona speakers with them, and they kept telling us, well, what we heard last night was stories about what happened in the old days, and grandfather was there, and this, and one of the children got a clout, and it was all routine run-of-the-mill stuff. So we never ever got anything out of that, and whether the lady in the hut or the people there had realized that we put something there or suspected, I think we were probably led up the garden path on that particular one. So those sort of things were not particularly successful.
Yeah.
But just just interesting things that happened on the whole thing.
I once had a meeting, had a couple of beers with Ron Reed Daly, and he was talking about how at one stage they tried putting explosives into these radios that they put in the stores, apparently, and if you if you listened to the radio, it was fine. But if you tuned it to the Chimurenga station, you know, the Voice of Zimbabwe or something, then the radio used to blow up.
Okay, I'm sure there was also, you know, it's funny that a lot of these things were developed in South Africa by the CSIR, okay. Who actually were also involved in the minefield. And it's still in existence today in South Africa, the CSI under Denel, I think the arms producers there. Yes. But I think they were a lot of the money and the sort of know-how came from there to try and help us. I think they were experimenting for themselves, let's face it, and just using us as guinea pigs on the whole thing. Talking about funny things too. I mean, I mentioned in the Enterprise thing that the pre-reserve air wing that we used once they were armed very, very effectively. We tried at one point, because Enterprise had the airstrip we used, they had a very nice long open airstrip, and it was in farmland, and the poor guys wanted to try constructing bombs. I think if you look in Op Enterprise in the book there's actually a picture of Victor Papa coming with whiskey Foxtrot Oscar with a bomb rack, with the gun door open, and then with a bomb rack on the strut. That was a PVC pipe, where another PVC pipe that was constructed to be a bomb was placed, and a brake cable was to release the bomb. Now we actually built it. We took a whole lot of mealie meal and powdered a 50-meter circle on a field on this particular farm, and the guys would load up at the airstrip, take off the bombs, and then try and get a dive profile organized to chuck these bombs into the circle. Well, the first couple of bombs didn't even land in the circle. So things got better, and fins were added. I can't remember, all sorts of things happened. But eventually they got sort of accurate within 50 meters. The Air Force, of course, would think that's absolutely terrible. But I only ever heard of them being used in my area once, when they tried to support a couple of party sticks. And I think it was more fracked on the party stick side than there was anybody else. So I don't think it was, it never, I think it died a natural death, because it really wasn't worth carrying on with that whole thing. Another, mines, you remember mines, we all, mines, landmines, everything else. I mean, I did a bit of research at the time when this poor fellow one of our motorcycle guys was coming back from a small punch up in the Chikwaka TTO with his stick of 6, and he was riding down a sandy path which was used by animals and stuff all the time, and he rode over a mine, and it went by the fragments. We discovered it was a TM46, which is designed to, as you know, immobilize tanks and vehicles and stuff like that. And when the engineer said it's actually a TM46, we said it can't be, because it requires 21 kilograms to set off a mine, and a motorcycle tire generally does not put anything like that on the ground. Okay. So somebody must have got clever and put a special device on that to detonate that, and it was a very sad casualty and a very unusual one. And once again, back to your day, it's this poor guy in that way. So it was these sort of awful experiences all came upon us. The guy, his name was Ephraim Folker.
Okay, and he was killed.
Yeah. Oh, more than killed, obliterated. Very sad. And a couple of guys in his stick had bits of shrapnel in them or whatever, but it was hit the front wheel. Sure. So somebody got clever and put some form of a triggering device that didn't require a lot of pressure. The only other thing, last thing I sort of got on my random notes here is I was asked to speak about it by Hannes, but we got sidelined or whatever. Was the things called the Q cars, operated by 4RR. My first experience with a Q car was I was at the base, the Enterprise, and this looked like a bread van or whatever appeared, and I went outside, and the driver asked for me. At that point, the driver was obviously a soldier. He got out, and he had one leg. And he said, so we've been sent to see you about doing some operations here. So I said, okay. Sorry, who are you? He said, please, can we just go around the back here, around the back of the tennis court pavilion there. He said, well, then we'll show you what the situation is. So we went around the back, and they opened up the vehicle, and it was a nondescript sort of bread van, but clearly had a very, very supported chassis. And as the guys got out, it was like looking at a bunch of pirates. They were generally wounded and slightly disabled guys from many, many punch-ups, obviously, all over the place. And they operated this vehicle, which they called a Q car. Now, it was designed that you could sit inside. It had a very much bigger engine than it should have. The driver could drive, obviously, and normally that was entrusted to somebody who knew the area well or whatever. Obviously, a black guy, but otherwise it'd be stick out like a dog's. But in the back were, when the lid flew open, were 4 MAGs, one on each corner. And it was a complete entrapment device. That's what it was. It was, a force multiplier in that instant. And we, I took a look at it and I thought, this is great. We can certainly try and use this. Knowing full well that you can probably only ever use it once, because it's going to get compromised. And we did use it twice, once with very good success. In the top of the Chikwaka there, where they stopped at a store ostensibly to deliver bread, and a group came around the corner of the store, obviously wanting to steal the bread, and the thing popped up, and all hell let loose, and at least half the group fell over. So that was the 4RR Q cars. But they had a very cushy posting. They were posted at the Beverly Rocks Hotel. That was their barracks. So I don't think they did too badly, but they were a real bunch of delightful scoundrels who I wouldn't trust with my wallet. That was for sure. They're a great bunch of guys. John, and that's just a sort of rambling catch up of things that have happened and come through to me. People ask me to tell about this, tell about that. So I thought I'd give it a bit of a roll on that. And I hope people enjoy it.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Mike. That was very informative. What amazes me is how much secondary information emerges in the comments of these videos.